good afternoon. I appreciate you joining us today for Grow Sessions with TSR Grow. My name is Zachary Taylor. Today, I am the guest host, and I'm really honored to have my friend and I would consider a colleague here, Jason Begley. How you doing, Jason?
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for having me, Zach.
Yeah. So, what I think makes this podcast unique is I've always been on the other side of the coin. So it's great to interview somebody and to be able to interview somebody with the respect that you have in the industry and that is well versed and knowledgeable. I'm very much looking forward to this. So thank you so much for your time.
Awesome. No, I'm stoked to be here.
Yeah. So just to let the the audience know, I think what's cool about the cannabis culture and the industry is it certainly is it's a small industry when we really get into it. So Jason and I had a conversation about a year ago, and here we are on a podcast together. So it's pretty cool how life can come full circle.
Yeah, was that it? That was at MJ Biz, I believe, right?
It was. It
In
was.
Vegas. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like to start off with just a brief introduction about myself, and then I'll let you do the same, Jason, and then I'll just kind
Cool.
of get into some of the questions I have for you.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah. So again, my name is Zachary Taylor. I've been fortunate enough to be in this industry for this is my 18th year. I have received my caregiver license in Colorado in 2006, and have been a part of the commercial legal outfit since 2012. I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to team up with a group of investors and I'm part of that investment group for Bountiful Farms. And so I'm a part of that C-suite. I've been with this company, which is kind of a dinosaur these days, about 7 years. So we have been in production about 5 years. We are an award-winning cultivation and dispensary, and we mostly specialize in solventless. So we are, really focusing on, the bulbous trichome heads and breeders that are focusing on resin production. And, obviously it starts with flower. Flower is king, but we talk about, rosin is kind of the prince. And then, just the parallels between Jason and I, we have our own tissue culture department that has been successful for the past 2 years in terms of helping us integrate in the science that is tissue culture and providing us back clean genetics in-house. And really, there's a lot of advantages from that, which we'll get into. But again, I think it's great to have those parallels and to be able to have our own tissue culture department and then talk to somebody who is running a successful tissue culture company. So with that being said, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Zach. Yeah. So again, my name is Jason Begley, CEO and founder of Zennetix. So I've been in the industry, I'd say going on 20 years, maybe 20 years plus, born and raised in Southern California. Spent a lot of time cultivating there. Started off the career with owning a hydroponic store quite a long time ago. Got into cultivating all over Southern California. Then from there, got met a friend that owned a tattoo shop in Puerto Rico. So he was coming into my hydro store and he asked me if I wanted to go to Puerto Rico because he has access to the health department there. So went to Puerto Rico and applied for cannabis licenses and was awarded the first cannabis license in Puerto Rico called Caribbean Green. And then so ran that for about 4 years, came back here to the States, started a consulting company, kind of traveled around, doing a bunch of consulting. And it was really during that time, going from facility to facility, we were mainly hired in because something, is usually wrong with that facility. And we're hired in to kind of figure out what the problems were. And, 10, 12 years ago, hop latent wasn't really a thing. Most people didn't know about it, so I was hired to come in to try and figure it out. And, the first thing we would always look at is, genetics, of course, and environmentals and lighting and nutrients and, this and that. But, fast forward a few years, that's when we really started, testing for product. And once we started testing, we started finding hop latent is everywhere, so starting to look into it and finding all the other viruses and viroids out there that kind of plague the industry. That's when I really, found out about tissue culture. And that's when I really, really wanted to dive into tissue culture and kind of segue my cannabis career from being a cultivator into more of the science part of it and get into the tissue culture part of it. So about 5 years ago, I moved here to Texas, and figured out if I wanted to stay in the industry that tissue culture would be kind of like my avenue of staying in the industry without, doing anything illegal here in Texas. So the first thing I did was look for the attorney firm that drafted the hemp laws here in Texas, and which is Ritter and Spencer. And so we went ahead and hired that attorney firm to come on board and basically give us their blessing that what we're doing here in Texas by doing tissue culture work is on the up and up here in in Texas, and being able to operate under a hemp license and also a federal USDA floral nursery license as well. So that's what we did. And then so as soon as I had her blessing, then I basically went on and started the business plan, put together the pro forma, and then started raising money for the company. So our goal with Zennetix was basically to just start really, really slow, build the protocols, bring in all the cultivars, rigorously test all the cultivars, make sure that everything is clean. And then from there, starting to work on all of our protocols, optimizing our media, work on storage, and then develop kind of who Zennetix really is as a company, and that was 3 years ago. So since then, I've spent this last year really building a solid foundation, bringing on, a really world-class known R&D director, another really good lab director that combined, they've got about 35 years experience in the industry. So besides them, and then now, a new marketing director, and the only thing we're lacking now is really bringing on a big sales team. So now that we built the foundation, now that we're scalable, that's the biggest thing with tissue culture. And I'm sure, as you know, Zach, is getting to a point of scalability. Can you multiply? Can you get to 10,000 shoots a month, 20,000 shoots a month? Because it's funny, when I first started this, I always thought the multiplication would be the hardest. And then we got into multiplication, and then optimizing the media and finding, what cultivar likes what media is one thing. But then you go into the rooting and the acclimation phase, and that's a whole nother beast. And, being having a background of a cultivator, as you've probably taken a million clones in your life. It's not even the same beast at all, right? Like,
No.
it's not like dipping it in some Clone-X and plugging it, throwing it into the dome, and yeah, it's just a completely different beast. So even that process right there was just a big hurdle. But now that all those hurdles are down, we've got everything in SOPs, all intellectual property, and but yeah, now we're fully scalable and ready to roll with it. But yeah, that's kind of my background and the struggles we've gone through so far.
Yeah, no, it's always awesome to hear people's background and how they got into cannabis and how they've stayed into cannabis. And in the ever-changing climate that is cannabis today, we all are having to pivot in a lot of different ways. And so I want to touch on the fact of, you talked about the biotech sector, right? I kind of call it the bro science, right? If you look at, there's a lot of evolutions in this industry, from the commercial cultivation avenue as an example. We used to, on the hobbyist level or in the black market, legacy market, I don't know, whatever you want to define it as, right? Oftentimes success was defined as, your pounds per light, right? And then you get
Yeah.
into, really understanding EBITDAs and all of those things. And you're looking at now how you truly define it as more grams per square foot or, grams per watt. And, I think that those parallels are true, when you look at regenerative practices that are very common in other commercial agricultural, species, and how kind of cannabis has been behind on that. Now, some of that's from the elasticity of that. Some of that is, kind of on that bro science. But if you kind of touch on that, I mean, I remember back in the day, we called it dudding. We called it a bunch
Yeah.
of things, right? I mean, I guess the true definition would be, I believe it's a epigenetic plasticity. But when you look at, how this viroid, really impacts the genes, and then when you continue to take cuttings off of that sick mother, um, I guess, that leads into, I guess, just one of my first questions of, talk to me about some of the, business models and some of if I was going to be a client of yours, and I wanted to go through some of the processes, there's some of, uh, I guess, what you're offering as a business rather, what I mean? So is cleanup one of those aspects? Is multiplication, initiation? So talk to me about how it engage, as a client.
Yep. Yeah. No. So we pretty much offer every service from a tissue culture company that's out there. From initiation, remediation, long-term storage, short-term storage. We have what we call a demand planning service, and then whether we're doing mother stock replenishment or full production runs. So our basically our bread and butter is contacting these larger operators, MSOs, and really getting them to sign up with a what we call our demand planning service. And what that is they would send in their cultivars, though, those cultivars that they've spent years and a lot of money building their brands around. They send them in, they get them initiated, we get them into culture, and then from there, basically we offer our demand planning service, which is we send them fresh, clean mother stock every quarter, right? So we charge $250 a month per cultivar. And so that basically keeps it in storage. It keeps it rotating within our library here in Zennetix. And then every quarter we're sending them fresh, clean mother stock. So they know that every quarter they're getting fresh, Gen Zeros. The vigors is much better, as obviously, your protocols, I mean, it's like I feel like a lot of protocols in cultivation facilities have gotten so much better now than what they were 5 years ago. Where 5 years ago I wouldn't trust employees that they're going to be, they're going to make sure that their protocols are clean. Where now I feel like most MSOs and most larger operators have adopted some really clean protocols, but still at the end of the day, if you're getting fresh, clean mother stock every quarter, it just ensures that even if there was a pathogen or a virus that were to slip through the cracks, you're getting new, fresh, clean mother stock, in a couple months anyways, so it's just a reassurance knowing that your material is always going to stay clean,
Yeah.
and furthermore, even more than that, Zennetix is trying to position itself as more of like a pharmaceutical grade library where, we're here pretty soon. We're going to be partnering up with some different pharmaceutical companies and then also a few different universities for doing testing and possibly, hopefully getting into building, cannabinoid therapy drugs for cancer, for neurological diseases and stuff like that. So, as tissue culture is really the only real way to do that. So not only are you offering a true to type cultivar every single time, but it's clean. It's like, how many studies have you read where scientists have gone through and they've done a white paper or a study on this particular cannabinoid profile is shown therapeutic for this particular illness, but then when you read through it they popped a seed. Well, as scientists we can't rely on that data to be replicated over and over if you're popping a seed and you're getting different phenos out of it, right? Like, so the only real way to do that is truly to have a library in tissue culture that is offering, a true to type cultivar every single time, and if we have them in cold storage, we pull them out of cold storage and we can subculture them once a year, and then we have them in rotation and we're subbing them every 3 to 4 weeks, or we can slow them down and put them in like a mild cold room temperature, which then now we're subbing them only every like 3 to 4 months. So depending on what the customer is looking for, we can kind of tailor, different services for them.
So do you guys only offer Gen Zero then?
That's it, just Gen Zeros. Yeah, we don't do any Gen Ones, especially here in Texas. We don't want to run any potential risk of a cultivar running hot because, let's face it. I mean, most of your moms out there, they still could pop, more than 0.3.
Absolutely.
So here in Texas, we try and that was one of our things with our attorney. Just make sure everything's under 0.3. We're good to
Okay.
go.
Okay.
You know.
Yeah. So getting into, I define it as kind of a misnomer, right? I think that tissue culture often, it can be what, the definition of misnomer is, where it's just a hodgepodge of, kind of definitions. If you could, kind of, explain the difference between, initiation and the beginning, part of that, and how there's some kits out there that allow you to do that, and how that's a great start. But when you're looking at really getting down into the meristem and the undifferentiated clusters, and how that is still a part of the misnomer of tissue culture, but is more of a subcategory of that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question because that's one thing. Like I was saying a couple years ago, when Zennetix was trying to find out who we are as a company, I found that out really quickly that the verbiage is very important because as tissue culture is so new in the cannabis industry, it's important that we all kind of stick to the same kind of verbiage, so kind of just how you were just touching on Gen Zeros. We define a Gen Zero as, coming straight out of in vitro, going into an ex vitro plug, and then rooting ex vitro, and that's what you're selling. Gen One would be taking that plant material, converting it into a mother, and then you're cloning off that mother. That would be a Gen One clone. Still a really good product, but it's a Gen One clone versus Gen Zero. And then, yeah, regarding initiations versus meristems versus remediation, we would take an initiation. So let's say if a breeder comes to us and says, that they want one of their cultivars in culture, right? The first thing we're going to want to do is run a series of tests and check to see if that particular genetic is loaded with any kind of viruses or viroids, right? And if it shows negative for any kind of virus or viroid, then that would just be initiation. We're just initiating that culture, initiating that plant into culture. And from that initial initiation, through bleach or whatever sterilization process that you're using, we'll knock out any, topical pathogen or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But if it does show positive for hop latent or any kind of a virus or viroid, then that takes more of a modified meristem approach, and then there's a lot more testing, a lot more different material we're dealing with. That's why a lot of times when we have a customer that is looking to get their cultivars in vitro, if it shows, that the genetic is negative for any kind of pathogen, then we usually tell them it'll take about 6 months and it's about $2,500. If it pops positive for a hop latent, well, then generally it's about 8 months. We tack on a few more months in there for testing and just because we want to be really, really certain that viroid is remediated, although it's still not guaranteed, right? That's the crazy thing about hop latent.
It's late.
But if that's the case, then it's another 2,500 just because there's a lot more testing. And during that time, we keep that mother around the whole time. That way, if we lose any material for contamination, or we need to test more material, or we need to have anything other for testing, so we keep that mom around until that customer gets those plants back, and then once that's done, we'll get them back into rotation. We'll get those plants going. We'll optimize that media around that particular cultivar, and then from there we'll send the customer 6 cleaned up fresh plants. And then if that customer wants to enter into a demand planning service, then they'll pay $250 per month, and then they'll get that cultivar fresh, clean plants delivered every quarter.
That's awesome. So when you guys are testing for hop latent, and you're amplifying, and running that through a PCR, do you have? I've heard of some people. I just never have personally seen it. So for us, as example, our in-house testing is just a positive or negative, much like a pregnancy test, right? But I have seen more scientific and advanced qPCRs where it actually is, similar to a water activity where it's giving you a number. Do you guys have the ability to actually see the viral load, or is it simply just a positive or a negative?
So we're not set up here in the Texas laboratory to do PCR testing currently, although we do have a partner laboratory up in Oregon called Embryonic, and that company is set up to do PCR. So They run that, but what we do is we send our samples into a company out of California called ALNL, and they're really bad. They're really big in the ag sector, and so that's why we've cross-referenced them with multiple different companies, but then also with our in-house testing over in embryonic, we've tested kind of cross-reference them between our testing and their testing, and they're spot on. So they ALNL they do utilize a different method where we do show the titer. So whether the titer's a lot more prone to be in that particular segment of the of the petiole, usually, and that's where we have been finding that the most accurate testing is coming from is a petiole that's over 6 weeks old.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know some companies love to take root samples, and some take, from all over the plant. And we have too in the past, and same with embryonic, and that's where I'm getting a lot of the information from is our lab director and our R&D director have a lot of experience with ALNL and with hop latent. So a lot of those protocols have been adopted from them.
Oh, that's awesome. So, so Jason, obviously you are, self-taught and certainly, are walking the walk when it comes to your expertise. But in terms of your team itself and just trying to kind of provide others with a little bit of guidance or, in terms of what should be some of the background when it comes to academia, are you looking for working experience in biological or plant sciences, particularly with plant physiology, molecular ecology, or just walk me through some of the backgrounds that you're looking for or that maybe some of your team members have?
Yeah, no, that's another great question, and a big learning curve that that we've dealt with. When I first started, it was just, bootstrapped, really just trying to figure out tissue culture through whatever you can read online, through YouTube, taking a couple of courses. I took some courses in Cornell, took some other, tissue culture courses, and just kind of absorbed every bit of information that I could on tissue culture. And then I kind of just started really slow by myself and getting my feet wet. Then I hired another person. But since then, I've now had 100% turnover in my lab staff, and now we're hiring, educated tissue culture technicians. Our lab manager is educated in tissue culture as well. Granted, finding people that are educated in cannabis tissue culture is very difficult, especially here in Texas. Actually, it's impossible because there is none. We're the only ones. But so that's why I went ahead and brought on my R&D director and also my lab director that came from another company, which I won't divulge that information, but it's utilizing their expertise in the industry is what gives me the confidence knowing that Zennetix is not going anywhere, that we have now adopted some not adopt I don't even want to say adopted their protocols, but we've taken their protocols, mixed them with Zennetix protocols, and we've come up with all these new, protocols, whether it's media optimization, whether it's, initiations, remediations, getting the plants acclimated and rooted. So yeah, so when it comes down to hiring, I've actually made the mistake by hiring a couple of cannabis people, and that was probably the worst mistake I could have done because this is 100% not growing cannabis. So if you have it in your head that this particular cultivar looks like it has a nitrogen deficiency or a potassium deficiency, or I would do this or I would do that if it were a clone or if it were a mother plant, this is all science here. It's completely different when you're dealing with, optimizing media around in vitro cultures. So that's kind of been a challenge, understanding that and really hiring people that are scientists and not particular cannabis people to make decisions on how your cultures are going to react.
Yeah, no, I in the
I
same.
don't know if you've
Yeah,
experienced that in your lab or not, but I
yeah,
mean, you guys are obviously a successful cannabis operation. So Yeah. So I wonder, your scientists, do they have a cannabis background, or are they more of a plant tissue culture?
They are a plant tissue culture background.
Yeah.
So like you, it was myself and um, one of my colleagues. One of the things I'm proud of is we have less than an 8% turnover in our cultivation.
Nice.
So I mean, my guys who and gals who've been with me, since day one, pretty much in 2020. And so one of those gentlemen, had a deep interest and passion for biotech, and we took a course in San Francisco together from this gentleman, Dr. Klein,
Yep.
and certainly, I think like you, grasping the knowledge and kind of the intent behind it is one thing, but what I particularly found was, again, being in the cannabis cultivation and been around plants my whole life, this is a whole different ballgame, right? Even just the dexterity itself,
Yeah.
I mean, to be underneath that hood. So how we go about our meristem is it's a giant screen and there's a slight delay. So as you move your hand, there's a
Yeah.
delay in that. And even
Yeah.
just, and any of that primordial leaf on there, particularly when you're looking at cleanup process itself, and so yeah, it really does, take that scientist, and so that's one of the things that I've also learned is, when you look at tissue culture from bananas or soybeans, the size of the meristem is drastically larger than in cannabis itself. Uh,
Massive. Yeah.
so, and
Compared.
then looking at, certain plants' relationships with the equator, if you want to call them land races, but the Durban poisons and things of those natures, the cleanup is hard. I mean, the meristem is so small
Yeah.
and it takes several at bats, and so yeah, I mean, I think that you know, um, I guess that leads into kind of my next question is obviously the bureaucratic regulations, the illicitity, the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, the, 1 through 5 drug schedules, on and on. But in terms of, more on the scientific level, why do you think that cannabis is not on the same level of sophistication as other commercial agricultural crops?
Yeah. I just think that, I mean, how long has tissue culture been? It's been around for what, 20, 30, 40 years now,
Hmm.
something like
Hmm.
that. And,
Yeah.
just like you mentioned, whether it's strawberries, what is it, blueberries, bananas, all that stuff, most of that is tissue culture. So I just think the whole cannabis industry is still so far behind traditional ag.
Very
Now,
much.
um, one thing I'm really excited about is the whole rescheduling. Maybe that could add a lot more to scientific data coming out, and maybe that's the reason why. But we've been in contact with quite a few different universities now, and it seems like a lot of the universities are whether they've been into it for a couple of years, but it seems like a few more are now starting to open up to scientific research on cannabis plants, whether it's through tissue culture or whether it's just through the therapeutic benefits coming from different cannabinoids or terpenes. But yeah, I just think it's just has a lot to do with the stigma of cannabis, that it's still a federally illegal substance. So it's just but yeah, I don't know. That's my thought on it. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think it's twofold, right? I think in a lot of ways, because of the illicicity of this industry, I think and oftentimes, and unfortunately, I've, had a lot of friends who have it almost was a rite of passage through the drug war and unfortunately the impact of that, right? And so it used to
Yeah,
be where I've served time for this, and that was, an end to the industry, and I think that that is something that we still need to work on. I was kicked out of, pre-law for testifying against a marijuana bill in Colorado. So I am a huge
really.
advocate for drug reform and expungement, and really focusing on the disproportionate relationship of people of color in cannabis, and how
Mhm.
getting into Wagonut and all those other things of, the private prison sector and, particularly out there in Texas, right? You look at Taft, Texas as an example, right? And
Yeah,
so, um, yeah, I think that, the drug scheduling is a huge part of it, but I also think that because of that and because it was this counterculture, I think that there's been this kind of lack of acceptance into science, right? And I think that that's where the evolution of cannabis needs to go is we need to be on the same sophistication, the same level of cannabis. And, that doesn't mean, again, that I believe that anyone should be incarcerated for doing this. But I think that as we evolve and hopefully get away from, what has been the most inefficient war in our nation's history and start focusing more on how we can, tax this and regulate this on a federal level. I think that, it comes down into welcoming that. You hear it in the industry, oftentimes suits and things of those natures, but I think that it really takes a village. If you look at who's successful in this industry now, there still are a lot of successful growers, but it's a lot of people who have taken that knowledge of growing and adapted into other spheres like yourself. And so I think it's a double-edged sword there. I think that as an industry, we need to not be afraid to accept, the science and, to welcome, learning more, I mean, because that's one of the things I've always disliked is the whole master grower notion. I mean, we haven't mastered shit, what I mean? We're always
Right.
learning. And I think that,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
keep that is the only way to look at this because, again, I mean, as you look at, whether it's, something you expected or not, if you make cannabis your career, it is the fastest paced industry, I would argue, not only from a regulation standpoint, from a technology standpoint.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and even the whole fact that it's still, federally illegal as far as the marijuana goes, but you know, once that table turns and federal legalization comes around the corner, it's like this industry hasn't even got started yet. That's when the big institutional money will start flowing into this. So it's like, we've seen so many cultivators, start 10, 15 years ago, become hugely successful. And then a lot of those guys aren't even around anymore, whether it's from heavily regulated, uh, areas or whether, pathogens, viruses, viroids, plague a facility. But yeah, I feel bad for a lot of those guys who've been forced to kind of shut their doors because of regulations. But I feel like the guys that can hold on, especially some of those small craft guys that can just kind of hold on, wait for regulation to kind of come around and federal legalization. I think a lot of people will be, like I said, it's just this industry is just getting started.
yeah. So walk me through. Obviously, you don't have to name names unless you want to, but what are some of your ideal clients in terms of, I mean, I know you mentioned MSOs. Are these individuals who are looking at replacing their vegetative square footage? Again, I mean, being part of, a lot of build outs and designs, I mean, whether you're vertically integrated or not, obviously depicts the square footage, but you typically should be somewhere between 25 and 30% of your overall of your flower canopy in veg. So are they people looking to, more or less have you be providing them explants and they don't have their own mothers? Is this to where you're clean up or just, walk me through, who some of your ideal clients are and how you're able to benefit them?
Yeah. Yeah, no, good question. So, I mean, I would say our ideal clients are MSOs, of course, because they want to protect their brands that they've worked so hard for to, that are their staples, and getting them on the demand planning service, cleaning up their mother stock, getting them fresh, clean mother stock, you know, but we do have a couple of customers that rely on us for production runs, which as a cultivator, if you're going to rely on even a nursery to give you production runs, that's the scariest thing ever because we have to provide a large number of plants on a specific date over and over and over. So if you're somewhere close to that facility and you can drive to that facility and you know that there's going to be an abundance of clones ready, that's one thing. But being that we're in Texas and we have to ship out our plants, that's a whole nother thing. Now, this customer of ours that's in Oklahoma, it's only a 7-hour drive from here, so we're delivering his plants. And matter of fact, we're doing an order right now, 3,000 plants for him that we're delivering in 2 weeks, and then in another 4 weeks we're doing 4,500 for him, and then we're going to get on a cadence of every 3 to 4 weeks. I think we're doing 3,000 plants. But those are going to be delivered straight to them, but yeah, so to I would never ask a facility to get rid of their mother room and rely on
Yeah.
UPS or
Yeah.
even us in general,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
anything could happen, something could go wrong. And, we need another week or 2 weeks to get those plants rooted and hardened. Well, as no grow room should ever sit any longer than a couple of days, let alone a couple of weeks. Time is money. So to ask that, we never do, but we are getting customers to ask for that. So therefore, we're now looking at where we have those locations where we're getting, some requests for production runs. We're looking at local nurseries in that area to kind of adopt some of our protocols and kind of bring them on board as a Zennetix nursery to kind of look at them like we can ship them a bunch of plug plants, and then at that point, they can just do the rooting and hardening at that facility. And that would at least take that time and space away from our laboratory here in Texas, because we're pretty small. We have about 3,000 square feet to expand into. But I'm pretty confident we can still probably get between 30 to 50,000 plants a month out of here. But if we can plug and send them,
Yeah.
that's a whole nother story.
Yeah. So, obviously, with deliverables, having some, fluctuations there, but what are your average attrition rates once they're hardened off and once they're in the facility? Are you walk me through some of your attrition rates?
Yeah, so one of the things that we have made our protocol for Zennetix is I don't like to send anything out that's not fully rooted and fully hardened.
Hmm.
I know a lot of tissue culture companies are, as soon as they show roots, they're sending them.
Yeah.
But I prefer to send them, 3, 4, 5 inches tall, fully rooted, fully hardened, to where they're ready for a 50 to 55% relative humidity, 70, 78% or 70, 78 degrees Fahrenheit. I want them ready to go. Last thing I want to do is ship off some plants and and there's 20 to 30% failure rate out of them. So if anything's going to fail, it's going to be here in the lab. So whether there's a nutrition factor, whether like for instance, we have one of our genetics right now, that peach crescendo, actually. It looks great in culture. It's a little yellow. We're still trying to optimize the media in culture, because it's that whole saying, shit in is shit out. So if you put something, you go from in vitro to ex vitro, and we're taking those plants and we're plugging something that's still a little yellow, maybe a little hyperhidrosic, it's only going to get worse in the next couple of weeks. It's not going to get better once you go to plugging. Now, as soon as those plants start shooting some roots and they can feed off of those roots, now that's a completely different story. Everything yellows up. I mean, everything greens up and gets nice and vigorous and looks great. But in the meantime, when those plants are haven't rooted, then that's a whole different story. So that's why we really want to only send out fully rooted and hardened plants. And at that point, we're not, we've had a couple customers, of course, come back and say a couple plants didn't make it, but at that point we have 100% guarantee on all of our plants. We'll send out fresh, clean plants as soon as they're ready. And we're always pulling extra as well. So we get an order of 100, we're going to pull 150. We may get 10% to kind of die off here in the lab, but we always have extra. So
Yeah, no, again, tying in the parallels to the traditional clone market, I think that, there's been a lot of people who practice that nursery model and, and so, I mean, yeah, it's all about, yes, it is rooted with one taproot, but is that
yeah.
hardened? No, no. So yeah,
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying there. Yeah. So, yeah, so I had my tissue culture department just kind of provide some questions that are a little bit more scientific that I thought would be cool. Again, if any of this is getting into anything that would be intellectual, that you perhaps don't want to discuss, by all means, just let me know that. But I thought it would just be cool to have them be able to ask some questions. So one of the things, her name is Kiara. So she asks, does your lab provide phenotype specific media customization or morphogenic pathway optimizations? Example of shooting or callus initiation.
Well, I mean, internally, we do internal media
Hmm.
optimization per cultivar.
Yeah.
Um, and that's, to tell you the truth, that's always ongoing.
Yeah.
We all, as a tissue culture lab, you got to always have an R&D department, and that's the job of that R&D director is always optimizing that media, right? So whether you're looking for elongation of your internode spacing, whether you're looking for a shorter internode spacing, whether you're looking for morphology, whether it's color, whether it's your multiplication rate, there's so many different factors, right? So you're optimizing it for each one of those factors. So internally, yeah, we're always optimizing,
Yeah.
you know.
So obviously with different states. So I guess so one of the things that I think that makes Bountiful Farms unique with our tissue culture department. I'm friends with Dan at Node Labs, and he came and toured our facility, and he was just like, "Man, I'm jealous of the fact of I never get to see these plants grown out." Right. So
Yeah,
we have the ability to have our tissue culture department, which is down the hallway, which then we provide into our R&D, where we're able to then pheno hunt, and really, a soup to nuts, which is,
yeah,
a unique ability in terms of there are a lot of, tissue culture. There's not a lot of tissue culture companies, but there are, a handful of them, but,
mhm,
most are, limited to, like you said, focused on the Farm Bill Act and don't have the license to cultivate the cannabis as, the cannabinoids become more prominent. And so I think that that's one of the really cool things is to be able to establish the relationship with the plant in vitro and then to be able to take that relationship and see it to its full fruition.
yeah,
um, but so in Massachusetts, one of the things that it's one of the more heavily regulated states. So N-butyric acid, as an example, is seen as a PGR, so it is outlawed.
mhm.
So are you exploring or do you explore any novel or non-conventional plant growth hormones, such as like gibberellic acid or anything, or are you more on the traditional in terms of IB3?
Mainly traditional. We have explored some different hormones such as gibberellic acid and stuff like that because it does crazy things in culture. I mean, it does crazy things to the plant in general, but even in culture, it's interesting to see cultivar specific what that does, for elongation and all that. But yeah, no, we mess around with a lot of stuff here in Texas. It's kind of the wild, wild west. There's not a lot of stuff there's not a lot of regulation in our industry here in Texas for what we're doing, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is, a great question to kind of end on. What key metrics or performance indicators do you use to evaluate success when managing a large scale tissue culture operation? And I'm asking this both from a lab perspective as well as a business perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say it's a few different things. Obviously, as you know, tissue culture is all labor intensive. It's massive amount of labor. So the name of the game is multiplication. If you're in the business, like Zennetix business model is mass production of plants. So we're in the game of producing a large number of plants, and so therefore it comes down to multiplication rates. So and that all comes down to your media optimization. We can when I first started, you know, uh, starting off with some MS media and some, your basic hormones, it was you can get plants out, but you're not getting that 3 or 4 or even a 5x multiplication rate, and that is what I would compare to like back in the day, like how you brought up, 3 pounds per light or 3.5 or 4 pounds per light, you know what I mean? So in a tissue culture world, I think that's it. So are we getting a 3x? Are you getting a 4x?
Mhm.
So that's what it all comes down to because it's all labor intensive. So the more plants we can produce in vitro, and then from that's one part of it. But then how many successful plants can you get rooted and hardened out the door is the second part of it. And that's the challenge for scalability. So if you can knock those two things out, then you'd be successful,
Yeah. So tell me what Q3 and Q4 looks like for Zennetix. What do you have planned for the rest of the year? I know the European market, obviously seems to be looking at American genetics and tissue culture with Germany coming on and other avenues. Why don't you just tell me what you have planned for the next couple quarters here?
Yeah, no, so we just signed with a lot of legacy breeders, so we just brought on Johnny over at Huckleberry, brought on Jason over at Ridgeline, bringing over Mark over at Green Shock, bringing on Nimbus, bringing on Micaiah from Abacaba Heirlooms. So bringing them on as we're starting what we're calling a breeders council and utilizing that breeders council to really not only drive their cultivars, but mainly tell their stories, because Johnny's got some crazy stories, Jason's got some crazy stories. Like
Yeah.
like if you're a breeder that's been around in the legacy market, you got some crazy stories, and they're just so cool to listen to those guys, and the
Yeah.
history of them, so really bringing their cultivars to market here at Zennetix, we're going to push the breeder's library first, and it's all going to be about Huckleberry. It's all going to be about Green Shock. It's all going to be about Ridgeline and Abacaba. And Zennetix is just the tool to offer those cultivars, So that's number one. But number two is one of the things I'm really excited about. And my passion project in the cannabis industry has always been medical and pharmaceutical. So really partnering up with some different pharmaceutical companies that hopefully going to be coming up here in the next 6 months. And then really going out there and finding those cultivars with those minor cannabinoids to get into libraries. So I'm working with a couple of universities right now and some pharmaceutical companies to determine what cannabinoid profile, what terpene profiles are really beneficial for, cancer treatments, neurological treatments, or whatever that may be. And then Zennetix will be the company to go out there, and I'm going to go out there and start hunting for all of those. Cannabis Genetics, obviously running DNA fingerprinting through medicinal genomics or through LeafWorks, and offering a library, a pharmaceutical library for a lot of these guys. And then that kind of segues into what you were saying with the European market coming online. So I'm partnering with another company out there. Can't say their name yet because nothing has been signed yet. We're under NDA. But in the German market, as they're going off of what they're calling social clubs, and those social clubs are limited to. And I know here in the United States, we're thinking of a social club as like a smoking lounge, but that's not it. Social club in Germany is a cultivation facility, right? And they're limited to the amount of square feet, or I guess there would be meters, right? But they're limited to the amount of space that they have. So call it 5,000 or 5,300 square feet. So we're partnering with a group there that has 18 licenses, and they're not putting one mother room in any one of their facilities because they need to utilize as much square foot to be an asset generating real estate, right? So if you're going to do that, maximize your square foot with flowering canopy. So what we're doing, Zennetix is going there to develop a tissue culture laboratory in Germany, which will be partnering up with those grows in order to offer plant nurseries all around Germany. So Zennetix will be able to provide the mother stock for these nurseries. These nurseries will then grow up all the mothers and then offer Gen 1 clones to all of these 18 licenses, and then beyond to any facility there in Germany. So we're talking to, other tissue culture companies in Switzerland, other tissue culture companies in Portugal and in Spain. So we're really trying to, transition Zennetix into becoming a global wide provider of whether it's pharmaceutical grade, GMP, certified tissue culture plants, but then also with our Breeders' Council, developing a United States Breeders' Council and then a European Breeders' Council, and then bringing them together to just do some really fun projects on the recreational side as well. You know.
Wow. No, it's impressive, man. It's it's really great to see good people succeed, and I mean to see this come from just an idea, and really, I mean, you guys you're doing it, you're crushing it, I mean, so it's congrats to you, my friend.
Cool. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it, man. Yeah, I'm super stoked you reached out. Like I said, it's been a while since we've seen each other. I've been seeing you on TSR Grows posts all the time, and then posted up in your facility. So I can't wait to get an invitation, come out to your facility sometime. And same thing, you ever
Yeah,
here in Texas, you and your team are always more than welcome to come by and do a lab tour.
absolutely. Well, appreciate you helping me get my feet wet as my first host, and yeah, this was a lot of fun. So thanks again, Jason.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right, Zach.
Yeah.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
I'm Zachary Taylor. This is my friend Jason Begley. This is TSR Grow Sessions. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Zach.